somehow we lost our way. And in the Brazilian case, tracking just the last 40 years, you can see public expenditures as a ratio of GDP coming from 18% under the last two military governments, when 18% at the end of the military government was already 22, 23. Then the civilian governments, one after the other, 30%, 36, 40, 45%. So you saw not only a lot of misfunctionings, because when you're spending too much, for instance, in the Geisel government, which was the one before the last of the military government, he was recycling petrodollars and spending a lot through state companies. So our history of a sequence of exchange rate crises began there. Then the last military government with Figueiredo, it was the threat of hyperinflation. Inflation came from 30%, 40%, 100% to 200%. And then 2-3 years, stable, if you could imagine something like that, stable around 200% inflation. All the economy indexed, wages, rents, everything indexed. Then the civilian government, first elections, and then we went to hyperinflation, 5,000%. And then we began fighting symptoms of inflation instead of fighting the underlying phenomena. We began attacking symptoms. We have frozen prices, then we froze financial assets. Then eventually we learned the importance of the central bank, of floating rates. But still, because public expenditures was uncontrollable, we just switched inflationary finance for a snowball indebtedness. Then internal debt came from 20, 30% of GDP to almost 80% of GDP, which is where we are now. And then at the end of these 40 years, what we saw with this uncontrollable expansion of public spending, the corruption of a democratic system, and economic stagnation. So it is not something that happened suddenly to Brazil. Brazil was growing 7.3, 7.4 average for 2, 3, 4 decades. Then we decelerated to 5% at the end of military government. Then we began 2, 2.5 for 15, 20 years. And then we collapsed to 0 and eventually minus 3%, minus 3%. So it is a long story. I compared it to a harpooned, a whale, big whale, a giant dimension. It was a continent. It's a continental dimension economy with natural resources, with everything. And then we are harpooned with very high interest rates, with hyperinflation, with a lot of bureaucracy, high taxes. Eventually, you kill the whale.